They expected chains, darkness, and punishment, yet what greeted them was light order and something they had never imagined possible in the hands of an enemy. The German women prisoners marched across the yard under the wary eyes of armed guards, braced themselves for the cruelty they had been told was inevitable. Propaganda had painted the Americans as savages who would strip them of dignity, starve them, and work them to death. But as the gates of the U.S. prisoner camp swung open in the late summer of World War II, reality defied every expectation. Clean bunks lined the barracks. The air carried the smell of warm food instead of rot. Most shocking of all were the flush toilets, gleaming fixtures that symbolized not humiliation, but an almost bewildering respect for basic human needs. This was not the prison of nightmares they had envisioned. Instead, it was a jarring contradiction to every story whispered back in the Reich. How could it be that the enemy, the supposed monster, offered them comfort greater than many of their own homes had known during the war? The shock rippled through them, unspoken yet powerful, unraveling threads of belief that had been stitched into their minds for years. In that first bewildering moment, fear began to turn into confusion, and confusion edged toward a dangerous kind of curiosity. What else about the world outside their borders had been a lie? And if the Americans could shatter one illusion so effortlessly, what other truths would soon be revealed? Right when the gates of the camp swung open, a chill ran through every spine. The crunch of boots against the gravel echoed like a drum beat inside their chests, each step pulling them closer to what they thought would be their undoing. The guards stood in rows, rifles resting against their shoulders, eyes stern and unreadable. Yet there was no cruelty in their movements. No sudden lash of a whip, no barked orders spat like venom. Instead, there was precision discipline, a silence that weighed heavier than shouting ever could. The prisoners, still trembling from the long transport, found themselves gripped not by the violence they had been told to expect, but by something far stranger, an orderliness that felt almost alien. This was not the chaos of brutality they had prepared their hearts to endure. This was something else, something that confused them far more deeply. They shuffled forward, chains clinking softly, though the guards did not jerk them or drive them with blows. The stillness of the place pressed against their minds. Tall fences loomed above the wire, sharp and glinting in the afternoon light. But beyond the barrier, the camp itself looked too clean, too arranged, as if it had been built not to crush them, but to contain them, with a kind of reluctant dignity. For a moment, one of the women dared to lift her eyes, expecting to meet the sneer of a soldier drunk on power. Instead, she found only a face carved from stone, steady, controlled, a face that gave nothing away. That quiet restraint unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. Cruelty she knew how to fight in her heart. Restraint left her unmoored. Her breathing grew shallow. Could this truly be prison? Her mind scrambled for an anchor, reaching back to the whispered warnings, the late-night tales of Americans who stripped prisoners bare, who dragged them into pits and left them begging for scraps of life. Yet here, as her feet crossed the threshold, none of those terrors materialized. She smelled not decay, but the faint trace of soap. She saw not cages, but rows of barracks standing in grim yet undeniable order. The contradiction gnawed at her, and she bit her lip until she tasted blood, trying to reconcile the impossible with the real. The silence of the guards became its own voice, whispering into their minds questions they could not voice aloud. Was this calmness the prelude to something worse? Was it a trick designed to strip them of hope before crushing them completely? Every instinct screamed to remain wary, to believe in the cruelty promised to them. Yet every glance they stole around the camp betrayed no immediate malice. Even the dogs leashed at the edges did not lunge or snarl. They sat rigid, as disciplined as the men who held their reins. The women's fear did not fade, but it twisted into something more dangerous: confusion. Fear could be endured. Confusion spread like smoke, seeping into the cracks of their certainty. One prisoner, her legs weak from the journey, stumbled as they neared the barracks. She braced for the blow, the shout, the humiliation that surely must come. Instead, a guard barked a command not of rage, but of order, steady and clipped, as another soldier gestured for her to stand. The lack of cruelty stung more than cruelty itself might have. She had been prepared for pain, for degradation, for something that matched the horror stories. But this calm enforcement of rules, this structured control, it disarmed her. She rose shakily, cheeks flushed with shame, not because she had been beaten, but because she had not. It was as though her fear had nowhere to land, leaving it to swirl inside her like a storm without ground. As they moved deeper into the camp, the first impressions burned themselves into memory. The barracks were wooden, long and narrow, but the windows let in light. The paths between them were swept clear, the ground hard but clean. There was no stench of neglect. Some dared to glance toward the horizon where the sun sank slowly, its glow touching the fences with fire. In that light, the camp looked less like a dungeon and more like a place suspended between punishment and something unnameable. Their hearts ached with the strangeness of it, the unbearable thought that perhaps their captors intended to treat them with a kind of grim fairness. The silence between the women thickened. Each of them carried the same question, but none spoke it aloud. Could this really be prison? Could these men drilled in their movements and rigid in their posture truly be the same enemies painted as devils? The doubt hurt more than hunger. It rattled the foundations of their beliefs. One of them clenched her fists so tightly her nails cut into her skin, desperate to hold on to what she had been told. Yet even as she clung to those lies, her eyes betrayed her, flicking again and again to the strange order, to the discipline that had replaced the brutality she had braced for. Her thoughts turned inward, heavy and unsteady. Maybe this was a mask. Maybe the cruelty would come later, when their defenses had weakened. But what if it wasn't? What if the first steps they had just taken into this camp were the first steps into a truth no one had prepared them for? The question lingered like a shadow, and though none dared to give it voice, it throbbed in every heartbeat, pressed against every breath. Each step deeper into the camp was not just a step into captivity, but into a new, bewildering world, where everything they thought they knew was crumbling beneath their feet. The moment their eyes adjusted to the dim light inside the barracks, the strangeness deepened. It was not the nightmare they had braced for during the endless train ride, nor the whispered horror stories passed between trembling lips in the night. They had expected filth clinging to every surface, damp straw reeking of sweat and rot, the stench of despair hanging in the air like smoke. They had pictured chains rattling against stone floors, guards laughing as they threw scraps of moldy bread onto the ground, and cold iron bars that turned human beings into caged animals. But as the women stepped further into the room, their senses betrayed them. The barracks, though simple, carried an orderliness that struck like a blade through their defenses. Wooden bunks aligned with military precision bore mattresses covered in clean, pale sheets. Pillows rested at the head, not soft like home perhaps, but still more than they had dared to hope for. The scent that rose was not of decay, but of linen, washed and dried. One woman reached a trembling hand to touch the corner of the bedding, half expecting her fingers to sink into filth. Instead, she felt fabric rough, yes, but undeniably clean. She pulled her hand back as though she had touched fire, her heart hammering against her ribs. In that silence, the weight of comparison fell on them all. Memories of the Reich's warnings came rushing back. The Americans will strip you of everything. You will rot in their cages, starved and beaten until nothing remains. The voice of propaganda had been sharp, constant, drilled into their bones, until it seemed like truth. And yet, here they stood, not starved, not stripped, but staring at bunks that looked almost merciful. A strange shame washed over them, because part of them longed to collapse into those beds, to surrender to the exhaustion that gnawed at their bones. But another part, the louder part, refused to accept this sight at face value. Surely it was a trick. Surely the nightmare would come later. Then came the smell curling from the far end of the barracks, slipping under the door, drifting into their nostrils with an ache of memory. Food. Not the acrid stench of spoiled scraps, not the bitter water they had forced down in transport, but the unmistakable scent of something cooked, something warm. The air carried it softly, cruelly, like a reminder of a life they had lost. Stomachs clenched in unison, hunger roaring back to life, fierce and undeniable. One prisoner closed her eyes and almost wept. She could see her mother's kitchen in that moment, the steam rising from a pot, bread crackling in the oven. The familiarity of it struck so deep that it tore at her soul. She had prepared herself for whips, for chains, for a descent into inhumanity. But she had not prepared for this comfort, masquerading as kindness, warmth, dressed as captivity. The guards ushered them forward. No shouts, no kicks, just firm hands and sharp gestures. They moved like shadows through the barracks, unyielding but never descending into cruelty. The prisoners sat stiffly on the bunks, eyes darting from the clean bedding to the steaming bowls now being carried in. Each bowl clattered onto the wooden table at the center of the room. The sound was simple, ordinary, yet it struck like thunder in the hollow chambers of their chests. Food, real food. They dared not look at one another as though even a glance might shatter the fragile illusion. The bowls held soup thin perhaps, but steaming, fragrant, alive, with the scent of vegetables and broth. Alongside it, slices of bread, not stale crumbs, but soft enough to bend crusts golden from the oven. One woman's hand shook violently as she reached for the bread. She stopped halfway, terrified that if she touched it, it would vanish like a mirage in the desert. Her eyes flicked to the guards, expecting a sneer, a mocking laugh, some sudden cruelty to snap her back to reality. But the guards said nothing. Their faces remained carved from stone, unreadable, offering neither comfort nor scorn. The silence cut deeper than any word could. Finally, she tore a piece of bread from the loaf. The sound of it breaking filled the room with unbearable clarity. She pressed it to her lips, tasted it, and her throat closed tight. It was real. The salt, the warmth, the softness against her tongue so achingly real that tears pricked her eyes. She swallowed and felt her body betray her, trembling with gratitude she did not want to feel. Around her the others followed, hands trembling, breaths unsteady. Every mouthful became a battlefield. With each bite, suspicion fought against relief. Was this nourishment or was it bait? Was this a mercy or a trap? The strangeness of it all gnawed at their hearts. They wanted to believe it, wanted desperately to give in to the food and the beds, to the promise that maybe captivity would not be the slow death they had imagined. But deep inside, a voice screamed in protest. This cannot be real. This is only the beginning. They will show kindness now only to strike harder later. And yet, even as those doubts festered, the warmth of the food spread through their bodies, loosening the knots in their stomachs, thawing the edges of their fear. The contradiction was unbearable. One prisoner, older than the rest, finally whispered what they all thought but could not say aloud. "It's a trap." Her voice broke the silence like a blade. Heads turned sharply, eyes wide, hearts pounding. The words made sense. Of course it was a trap. The Americans were cunning, clever in ways the Reich had warned them about. This was the game. Soften them, confuse them, make them drop their guard, and then crush them. The logic was unshakable. Yet even as they nodded, clinging to that explanation, the soup slid down their throats with a comfort that betrayed their own belief. If it was a trap, why did it taste like home? If it was a trap, why did the beds wait with clean sheets and pillows? The room filled with a silence thicker than before, broken only by the scrape of spoons against bowls. Each woman wrestled with herself in that silence, torn between the lie she had carried for years and the truth steaming before her eyes. The bread tasted too human to be deception. The soup smelled too honest to be a weapon. And yet their fear clung stubbornly, whispering that it was only the calm before the storm. The strangeness of the moment pressed on them, until their breaths came shallow and uneven. Some ate in quick, furtive gulps, as though racing before the cruelty returned. Others hesitated, nibbling slowly, testing each bite as though it might turn to ash on their tongues. The night descended outside, stars prickling the dark sky above the fences. Inside the barracks, the women lay on the bunks, bodies heavy from exhaustion, bellies warmed for the first time in weeks. But sleep did not come easily. Eyes stared at the ceiling, ears strained for the sound of boots, the crack of a whip, the proof that the kindness was a lie. Instead, the camp settled into silence. Guards patrolled with steady rhythm, dogs patted softly, and the night held no cruelty. It was too much to believe, and yet impossible to deny. The strangeness burrowed into their hearts, deeper and deeper. The clean sheets beneath them felt like chains. The bread in their stomachs felt like betrayal. They closed their eyes with tears they could not understand. Was this truly mercy, or was it the sharpest weapon of all? She sat at the edge of the bench, her back hunched, as though the weight of the air itself might crush her. The steam from the bowl in front of her rose in thin curls, soft and fragrant. Yet it felt like smoke from some hidden fire waiting to burn her alive. Her hands shook violently, not just from hunger, but from the terror of believing it could not possibly be real. For days her stomach had twisted itself into knots, surviving on scraps so small they barely reached her lips before they vanished. And now here it was a bowl of soup warm enough that she could feel its heat on her face. She did not dare to touch it. Every lesson, every warning drilled into her heart told her it was impossible. This was America. This was the enemy. And enemies did not feed you. They broke you. Her fingers curled into her lap, nails digging into her palms. Around her, the others sat in the same silence bowls, untouched bread, lying still on the table as if it were poisoned. The guards stood at the edges of the room, unmoving, their faces cut from stone, offering neither threat nor invitation. That stillness suffocated her more than cruelty would have. If one of them had shouted, if one had struck her, at least it would have made sense. But this silence forced her to decide, and the decision was unbearable. Finally, she moved. Her hand crept forward, trembling as though the air itself resisted her. She touched the bread first, the crust rough beneath her fingers, warm still from the oven. Her breath caught. She tore a small piece away, her hands clumsy, and for a moment, she simply stared at it, pinched between her fingers. A memory stabbed into her. Her mother's kitchen, the way bread used to crack open with steam curling out, her father laughing as he tore it in half. The memory hurt so much that her throat closed. She wanted to throw the bread back onto the table to push the bowl away to prove she was stronger than this trick, but her hunger betrayed her. She lifted the bread to her lips. Her hand quivered so badly she almost dropped it. The crust touched her mouth and the salt of it spread across her tongue. It was real. It was not ash, not mold, not the bitter filth she had braced for. She chewed once slowly, and tears burned her eyes. The taste was so familiar, so achingly human, that it broke something inside her. The others stared, hearts thundering in their chests. No one breathed. They watched her face as though their fate would be written there. Her expression shifted, first tight with fear, then loosening into something like wonder, then collapsing into disbelief. She swallowed hard, her throat working against the lump of emotion lodged there. The tears she fought spilled anyway, tracing lines down her dirt-streaked cheeks. Her shoulders shook once violently, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as though to stop herself from crying out. But the truth was already written in her eyes. The bread was real. The soup was real. And nothing she had been told could stand against that reality. A shiver passed through the room, silent but undeniable. One by one, the prisoners' eyes dropped to their bowls, to their bread. Their breaths quickened, chests rising and falling as though they had all been struck at once. If she could eat, if she could taste life where death was promised, then perhaps they could too. Yet that realization did not bring comfort. It brought panic. Because if this was true, then everything else they had believed might be a lie. The young woman lowered her hand slowly, fingers trembling against the edge of the bowl. She dared to lift the spoon. Her reflection wavered on the surface of the broth, thin, pale, but alive. She raised it to her lips, and the warmth spread through her body like fire through cold stone. The taste was simple, vegetables and salt, but it filled her hollow chest with a heat she had not known in months. She gasped, softly, unable to hide it. The sound tore through the silence, and the others stiffened as though struck. In that moment, everything inside her broke open. Fear had been her armor, but now confusion surged in to replace it. Her shoulders slumped, her jaw clenched, her eyes wide with shock that bordered on awe. She could not reconcile the world she had been promised with the world in front of her. And as she sat there, spoon clutched in her hand, her tears fell freely into the broth. The others could not look away. Every breath she took, every tremor in her hands echoed inside them. They had not tasted yet, but through her they already knew. Their own fear trembled, their own certainty cracked. Hearts pounded so loudly it seemed the guards must hear them. No words were spoken, no cries lifted, But something irreversible had begun. The young soldier had eaten, and the silence of the barracks became heavier than stone. The walls themselves seemed to press in, demanding acknowledgement of the truth. One after another, the prisoners' gazes darted between their food and her tear-streaked face. Suspicion remained, yes, but so did longing. And longing, they all knew, was the most dangerous weakness of all. In that single fragile act, bread to lips, soup, swallowed tears, shed, their world shifted. What they thought unshakable crumbled. And in the stillness that followed, each of them felt the ground beneath their beliefs begin to give way, leaving only the unsteady truth that perhaps the enemy was not the monster they had been told, and perhaps the cruelty they expected was not waiting just beyond the next breath. Yet that realization was not relief. It was terror of a different kind. For nothing is more terrifying than realizing you no longer know what is real. The longer they sat in that silent barrack, the sharper the clash inside their minds became. Every story they had carried from the Reich still echoed in their ears. Stories hammered into them by voices of power, by posters plastered on walls, by officers who swore the Americans were demons in human skin. They had been told that once captured they would be stripped, mocked, beaten, until they forgot they were women at all. They had braced themselves for chains and for humiliation so bitter that death itself might have felt like mercy. That was the picture painted for them day after day, until it became more than belief. It became the armor they wore against fear. Yet here in this place where they thought their worst nightmares would come alive, reality rose like a mirror to expose the lie. The guards who stood at the edge of the room were not snarling monsters. Their movements were sharp, yes, but measured, disciplined. Their silence was not filled with sadistic laughter, but with restraint, a kind of restraint that felt heavier than violence, because it robbed them of justification for their terror. The bread in their stomachs was not poisoned, not moldy, but nourishing. The beds that waited for them did not reek of decay, but offered rest. And slowly, unbearably, the truth pressed in. The enemy was not the creature they had been taught to despise. One of the women pressed her hands against her face, as if she could blot out what she was seeing. Her shoulders shook not from sobs alone, but from the weight of contradiction. She remembered the words of her commander, sharp and certain. "Better to die on your feet than fall into American hands. They will tear your soul apart." Those words had burned in her, had steeled her resolve as she was marched across fields of mud. But now, as she sat with warmth spreading through her body from the soup she had eaten, those words sounded hollow, like empty shells. Her tears slipped through her fingers because she knew that with every swallow, with every glance at the guards who treated her, not as a beast, but as a prisoner, bound by rules, the foundation of her world was collapsing. The others felt it too. They whispered to themselves in silence, clinging to the possibility that this was deception, that the kindness was a mask that would fall away once they were weak enough. Yet deep inside, each of them knew that the mask explanation was only a desperate attempt to protect the crumbling walls of belief. For the longer they sat, the more the cracks widened. The Americans were not shouting. They were not dragging them outside into the dirt. They were giving them water, food, space to sit, space to breathe. It was more than their own nation had given them in the final months of war, when starvation had clawed at civilians, when bombings had left families in rubble. The irony tore at them like glass in the throat. The hands they had been told to fear now gave them more dignity than the hands that had once sworn to protect them. One young prisoner could not stop staring at the guard nearest the door. His jaw was square, his uniform neat, his weapon ready at his side. He looked every part the enemy soldier, and yet when their eyes met for the briefest moment, she saw not cruelty, but something she could not name, perhaps only discipline, perhaps something more human. She looked away, quickly ashamed of the thought that had struck her he could be her brother if fate had drawn a different line. The realization shattered her composure. Her hands trembled so hard the spoon clattered against the bowl, and the sound echoed through the room like a confession none of them wanted to make. The truth pressed down harder, undeniable now. Propaganda had been a cage, built in their minds, but the bars were bending, breaking, and there was no stopping it. The enemy was not the monster. The enemy was the one giving them a bed to sleep on. The enemy was the one who did not raise a hand to strike them when they stumbled. And as that truth filled the room, it became almost unbearable. Because if that truth was real, then everything else, everything they had fought for, everything they had lost was tangled in lies. The shock of it sank deeper than fear. Fear was something they knew how to live with. Shock was different. It left them hollow, untethered, unable to trust even the ground beneath their feet. One prisoner clutched her knees, rocking back and forth, whispering to herself that it could not be true that tomorrow the cruelty would come. Another stared into the distance, her lips pale, as though she had lost not just her faith in the Reich, but in herself. What did it mean to discover that the world you trusted had lied to you? What did it mean to realize that the face of the enemy was not a mask of horror, but a mirror, reflecting back your own humanity? The silence of the barrack grew. Unbearable, each heartbeat a reminder of the fracture that had opened inside them. No one spoke, but they did not need to. The truth hung heavy, and it crushed them more ruthlessly than whips ever could. They had stepped into the camp expecting death to swallow them. Instead, they found themselves swallowed by doubt, by the unbearable recognition that the line between friend and foe was not what they had been told. And in that recognition, their fear deepened into something more corrosive, the terror of not knowing who to believe anymore or who they themselves had become. In the days that followed, the silence began to fracture. At first, it was only glances exchanged in the dim light of the barracks, quick and uncertain, as though even their eyes might betray them if the guards noticed. Then came whispers, faint as the rustle of sheets in the night words passed from one bunk to another when the camp had fallen quiet. No one dared to speak of it openly, but the truth they had witnessed pressed too heavily to be locked inside forever. The bread was real, one woman murmured in the dark, her voice barely audible. The soup, too, another answered with a trembling breath. Yes, I tasted it. It was real. And though fear still clung to them, like a second skin, those words spread rippling through the barrack, until the silence could no longer hide their thoughts. They had expected cruelty, degradation, the stripping away of dignity. Instead, each day brought something stranger: meals, served with clockwork precision, guards who barked orders but did not strike the rhythm of life that seemed harsh but not inhumane. Slowly, unwillingly, the prisoners began to admit what none of them had dared to believe. When they first stepped inside, this place was not the pit of hell they had been warned about. And with that admission came something far more terrifying than hunger or pain: a collapse of faith. One young prisoner clutched her knees as she whispered to the woman beside her, "They told us the Americans were devils." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head. "But look, they feed us better than we were fed at home." The woman beside her turned away, unable to answer because the words stung with truth. In the final months before her capture, she had watched her family starve, had seen children pick through rubble for crumbs, while officials told them to endure for the glory of the fatherland. Yet here, in the hands of the enemy, she was given warm bread and soup every day. How could she reconcile that? How could she face the betrayal that lived in her memory now? The whispers deepened over time, curling into conversations, tentative at first, but bolder with each passing night. They spoke not only of food and beds, but of the weight of lies they carried. Some confessed their confusion with tears, admitting they no longer knew who to trust. Others grew angry, their voices sharp in the darkness, railing against the Reich that had twisted their minds. "They lied to us," one hissed, her teeth clenched. "They told us monsters lived here. But the monsters are not here. They were behind us all along." The words hung heavy, cutting through the barrack like a blade. And yet even anger was fragile. For every woman who whispered her fury, another whispered her fear. If the enemy was not the devil, what did that make them? Prisoners of war, yes, but prisoners of truth as well, shackled by the realization that the line between good and evil was not where they had been told. It shook them to their core. At times the weight of it was unbearable, and some turned their faces to the wall, weeping silently into their pillows. They wept not only for their lost homes and families, but for the realization that they had been used, manipulated, betrayed by the voices they had once trusted above all. Gradually, their eyes changed. Where once they had looked at the guards with pure terror, now they looked with something more complicated. Curiosity flickered there, a strange recognition that these men were not demons, not shadows waiting to strike, but flesh and blood like themselves. They remained the enemy, no one could forget that, but they were also undeniably human. That realization cut deeply, for in seeing their captors as human, they were forced to see themselves as deceived. One afternoon, as they stood in line for rations, one prisoner dared to lift her gaze toward the guard who handed her bread. His expression was stern, his eyes hard, but for a fleeting second she thought she saw weariness there, a weariness that mirrored her own. The thought struck her so suddenly that her chest tightened, her breath catching. She looked down quickly, clutching the bread against her chest, her heart pounding. She wanted to hate him, needed to hate him, but she could not. Not anymore. At night, when the barracks lay in uneasy quiet, the conversations always circled back to the same unspoken truth. They could no longer cling to the lies they had been fed. Some resisted, still clinging desperately to the hope that cruelty would reveal itself eventually, that the Americans would show their true face. But each day that passed without that cruelty eroded the last defenses of their belief. They were forced to admit it, the Americans had not treated them as beasts. They had treated them, however reluctantly, as people. The weight of that truth was almost more crushing than the fear had been. It forced them to see themselves not as victims of American cruelty, but as victims of a darker betrayal, the betrayal of their own leaders. And in that shift, their world was remade. The Americans were no longer devils, no longer the monsters painted by propaganda. They were adversaries, yes, but adversaries who carried rules, order, and disturbingly, humanity. For many, this recognition tore them apart inside. They had lost families, homes, entire lives to this war. They wanted to cling to hatred because it was simpler, cleaner. But each time they laid down on clean sheets or lifted bread to their lips, the hatred faltered. And in the silence of their barracks, they began to look at the Americans with different eyes, not as saviors, not as friends, but as men, as human beings, who stood across the line of war, yet carried the same fragile dignity they themselves still clung to. The shift was slow, painful, but undeniable. Fear had been replaced by doubt, doubt by confusion, and confusion by reluctant recognition. And in that recognition, their souls trembled, caught between grief for what they had believed and awe at what they had discovered. For the deepest wound of all was not the war itself, but the shattering of the illusion that had once shielded them. Now, in its place, there remained only the fragile, terrifying truth: the enemy was human, and so were they. The days stretched into weeks, and with each sunrise behind the fences, the change inside them deepened. What began as shock at clean sheets and warm bread had grown into something far larger, something none of them could have foreseen when they first stepped across the threshold of the camp. Their minds, once braced like shields against the cruelty they had been told was waiting, now carried a different weight. It was not relief. They were still prisoners, still cut off from home and family, still stripped of freedom. But it was something more subtle, more dangerous than chains. It was the realization that the war they had been fighting in their hearts had been built on illusions, and that illusion had been shattered by the simplest acts of humanity. They carried this truth silently, each woman in her own way, but it seeped into everything. When news from the front reached their ears, they listened differently. Once they might have clung to stories of German victories, cheered at the thought of the Reich striking fear into the enemy. Now those stories felt brittle. How could they rejoice in images of the enemy as monsters when their own captors had treated them with more dignity than they had expected, even from their own leaders? The sharp certainty of propaganda no longer held them. Instead, there was hesitation, cracks in their conviction, the uneasy knowledge that perhaps the world was not as simple as they had been told. That hesitation was its own form of rebellion. Even in captivity, it weakened the hold of fear. They could no longer summon the same blind hatred that had fueled them before. They still longed for home, still mourned what they had lost, but the venom that once defined their vision of the Americans was gone. And in its place lay something quieter: recognition. Recognition that the men in uniform standing guard at the edges of the camp were not demons, but human beings, bound to their duty just as they themselves had been bound to theirs. That recognition changed everything. At night, when they whispered to one another in the barracks, their conversations no longer circled only around fear or hunger. They spoke of what it meant to be human, of what it meant to see the enemy in ways they had never imagined. Some said it outright, their voices trembling with the enormity of it. They are not devils, they are men. Others wept in silence, their tears an admission they could not bring themselves to put into words. But whether spoken or unspoken, the truth had lodged itself in their hearts. And that truth began to change the way they looked, not only at their captors, but at the war itself. The war was no longer a battle between good and evil, between angels and demons. It was something far more tragic, a struggle of men against men, fueled by lies, driven by pride, but pierced through by moments like this, moments where humanity refused to be silenced. The realization was unbearable and yet undeniable, and as they lay awake at night staring at the ceiling of the barracks, they understood that they would never again see the world as they once had. For many of them, this shift became the deepest wound and also the greatest gift. When the war finally ended and they were sent back, they carried with them a story that few outside could understand. They had seen the face of the enemy, and it was not the face they had been told to fear. It was the face of a man offering bread, the silence of a guard, who did not strike the steadiness of discipline where cruelty was expected. These images lived inside them long after the guns fell silent. They spoke of them in hushed tones, sometimes to their children, sometimes only to themselves. But the memory remained like an ember that refused to die. And in that memory was a lesson one carved not by speeches or victories, but by the quiet defiance of human dignity. It was proof that even in the firestorm of war, even in the darkest corners of captivity, humanity could endure. The women themselves became living testimony to it. They had walked into the camp certain they would find hell. Instead, they had found something that broke them more deeply, and yet healed them in ways they could not yet name. They had found respect in the unlikeliest of places. This transformation did not erase their suffering. It did not erase the pain of loss, the grief of separation, the bitterness of knowing they had been deceived. But it did plant something new inside them, something that could not be taken away. The knowledge that truth is more powerful than lies, and that even in war, the smallest acts of humanity could rewrite the deepest convictions. And so, as they looked back on those first days in the camp, they understood what it meant. The first step they had taken across the threshold had not only changed their own lives, but had written a chapter of history that few would ever know. It was a silent history, a history without parades or banners, but a history that lived in the hearts of those who endured it. That moment, the moment when fear gave way to confusion, when lies gave way to truth, was more than a memory. It was a reminder that even in the midst of destruction, the human spirit could survive, and even the enemy could reveal a face of compassion. And so it was that the first bewildering moment in the American camp did not simply change their perception of captivity. It changed the way they saw the world. That first step across the gates, that first taste of bread, that first night of clean sheets had not just altered their fate. It had carved into them a truth that would outlast the war itself. The first moment in the camp had not only changed them, it had written a silent piece of history, one that proved the power of humanity, even when surrounded by the fire of war. In the end, what began with fear and trembling footsteps through a prison gate became something much greater than captivity. These women walked into the camp expecting cruelty and humiliation, yet they found themselves facing a truth far more unsettling. The enemy was not the monster they had been told, but men who still carried discipline, restraint, and most painfully of all, humanity. From the first bite of bread to the whispered conversations at night, their illusions collapsed piece by piece, until what remained was not hatred, but a deeper understanding of what war conceals and what it reveals. This hidden chapter of history reminds us that even in the darkest storms, acts of humanity can burn brighter than weapons, and those who lived through it became living proof of that enduring light. But what about you? How does this story challenge the way you imagine war and the people caught in it? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective might open someone else's eyes. If you've ever wondered what other truths have been buried beneath layers of propaganda, stay with us, because countless forgotten stories still wait to be uncovered. From secret documents to voices that history nearly erased, there are treasures of memory and testimony that will change the way you see the past. Subscribe, comment, and keep the conversation alive, because every hidden piece of history we rediscover brings us closer to understanding the world we live in today. And remember, this is only one fragment. Many more untold truths are waiting just around the corner. Are you ready to uncover them?